Chuck, good to have you with us.
Mark, it doesn't get much harder than this.
Yeah, certainly a week of hard news for the Speaker himself. Look, Speaker Madigan has always prided himself on his ability to persuade people to see things his way. He took the stand and told the jury that he had no knowledge of his lieutenants landing on ComEd's payroll in those ghost contractor jobs, right as ComEd was lobbying him for hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. The jury still found him guilty. How big of a gamble was it for Madigan to take the stand, and did he say anything in his testimony that actually hurt his cause?
Well, that may be his final and perhaps his biggest mistake, other than getting into some of these deals and scams to begin with. Madigan, by taking the stand, has opened the door for him to be accused of perjury now at sentencing. And what everyone here on both sides of the bar expect that to produce is that he could look at another 2 or 3 years on top of what he is already going to get in his prison sentence. Because he, according to the government, we believe they will say that he lied in his testimony. So just on the face of it, the fact that he took the stand, swore to tell the truth, the government says, well, he couldn't have told the truth because the jury has now found him guilty of these things that he said didn't happen when he was testifying, could be a real problem for him at sentencing.
The feds really had to piece together quite an intricate puzzle to make their case here. And in the end, the jury only saw part of that full mosaic the feds were trying to paint. Was there a standout moment or a specific piece of evidence that you think swayed this jury?
Well, what it appeared played out in court is not necessarily what, in the end, swayed the jury. Some of the post-mortem interviews with jurors the last 24 hours would seem to indicate that it was the totality of this case that the feds brought against Madigan. They were overwhelmed by the detail and the various components of it, as opposed to one individual thing. It was interesting in some of the juror interviews that they didn't believe Mike Madigan clearly, even though it seems like some of them wanted to on the way in. And what Madigan had to say on the face of it seemed truthful, seemed legitimate, but as his testimony was picked apart by the government, they came to realize that he was dancing around things and that he really didn't have good answers for what the government was asking him about. And so back to the Madigan question, I mean, if there's a pivotal moment, it could be him taking the stand and the fact that the jury said, we don't believe you, Mike Madigan. Everything kind of falls apart from there.
He doesn't see this exactly as game over. In fact, he might see this as the end of the second inning here. Do you have any sense of whether the Madigan team intends to appeal? And how do their lawyers think about the Supreme Court's recent definition around what exactly a quid pro quo is? Could that play a role at the appellate level?
Well, first, the appeal. Undoubtedly, Madigan's team and Madigan himself will want to appeal various aspects of this. The Supreme Court ruling certainly would be one of them, and whether or not the government should have proceeded at all in this based on that. Madigan probably doesn't see it as game over, but at the age of 82, almost 83, he may be looking at a different calendar than all of us, and appeals take time. Mike Madigan is going to be sentenced at some point. There's no date yet, but when he is sentenced, it's undoubtedly going to be jail time. More than 2 years is what the consensus is of those I've talked to. So I don't know about the game over aspect of it. There's undoubtedly going to be an appeal, and the Supreme Court will be part of that.
A Springfield insider texted me after the verdict came down and said Mike McLean is the luckiest man alive, in their words. He was at the very center of all this horse trading and maneuvering, and in the end, jurors chalked his behavior up to a lobbyist being a lobbyist. How did the public perception of that word lobbyist perhaps play to McLean's advantage?
Well, it sure did play to his advantage. Something did, and that's about the only thing you could hang it on. Most people hear that term lobbyist only in stories involving corruption, and so they heard it thrown around frequently, heard him described as a lobbyist, as much as his defense team would like to play that down just because of the things that it connotates. But I believe that if you look at the juror interviews early on, one of the things that they did agree on was that they were not going to convict him. It didn't appear as though they needed to debate very much any of that because they didn't think the government had much of a case against him, or at least that he shouldn't be held liable for it.
A lot of politicians have walked in and out of that federal courthouse in Chicago, now branded as convicted felons. Where does Mike Madigan's case rank, do you think, in the history of Chicago corruption?
It has to be number one on the log of political corruption cases in Chicago and in Illinois. And let me tell you why. Not necessarily for the reasons you might think, but Mike Madigan had 50 years to clean up his act. He saw his friends, his cronies, his enemies, political players, attorneys, bagmen, officers of the court, you name it. He saw hundreds of people go away to prison because of similar kinds of allegations, and he did not change his own personal conduct. So that's why I would have to put him at the very top of the trash heap.
And last question for you before we let you go. You covered the rise and fall and now the redemption of Rod Blagojevich. His case seemed more clear-cut, the evidence more stark after Blagojevich was sentenced, and we heard him that last time in court. Did you ever see him come anywhere close to expressing contrition for what he had done?
No, and he has gone further from that, actually, Mark. He has not apologized, not admitted, in fact, appears to have walked back just about everything he was accused of, and it puts on a convincing show, actually, when you sit and talk to him about these things. This far out, not only has he seemingly walked a lot of these things back in his own mind, but he's convinced some of his supporters on the fringe of what he did professionally for decades here in the state of Illinois of the same thing, and is now looking at what his next move is going to be since he's been pardoned by the president. A run for the offices that he can run for, perhaps an ambassadorship. We heard about that this past week. So there will be probably a new day for Rod Blagojevich, reformed and rewritten in the history books.
All right, excellent insight and analysis, breaking it down for us. Chuck Goudie from Chicago. Thanks for joining us.